Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and turning on your tap, only to discover that there is no water. You go to the nearest well, but the water is contaminated. You travel farther to find another source, but hundreds of people are already waiting. Now imagine that this is not a one-day problem, but a daily reality for millions of people. This is why one of the biggest questions surrounding the United Nations Agenda 2030, climate negotiations, COP31 and Africa is surprisingly simple. Who gets access to water, and who decides? And there is one phrase in the UN Sustainable Development Goals that deserves much closer attention. Universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. What exactly does equitable mean? Does equitable mean everyone gets exactly the same amount of water? Or could it mean that some people, communities or countries receive more water because they have greater needs? And could policies designed to protect water resources ultimately create winners and losers across Africa? Let's break it down. What is Agenda 2030's water goal? The United Nations 2030 Agenda contains 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Water is primarily addressed under SDG 6, which calls for the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Target 6.1 specifically calls for achieving, by 2030, universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. Other targets address sanitation, water pollution, water use efficiency, sustainable withdrawals, integrated water resources management, ecosystems, international cooperation, and community participation. That sounds straightforward. But it is much more complicated when you apply it to Africa. Africa is not one water system. Some African countries have enormous rivers, lakes, groundwater reserves, and rainfall. Others experience severe drought. Some have abundant water but lack infrastructure to transport, treat, and distribute it. And some countries share rivers and aquifers with their neighbors. That last point is extremely important. Because water does not respect national borders.
Before we go deeper, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Thanks.
Does equitable mean some get more water than others? In practice, yes, equitable access can mean different levels of support. A rural village in the Sahel with severe drought might need more investment per person than a middle-class urban neighborhood with existing infrastructure. Informal settlements around big cities might need subsidized water or free public taps, while wealthier areas pay full cost. Refugee camps and conflict zones might get emergency water trucking, which is more expensive but necessary. So equity is about fairness, not sameness. If we try to give everyone exactly the same amount of water, we'd ignore different climates, desert versus rainforest, different levels of poverty, different levels of infrastructure and historical neglect. Equity says those who are most vulnerable, most marginalized, and most at risk should be prioritized so that everyone reaches a basic, dignified standard. But here is the big question. If equity allows different levels of allocation based on need, who determines what is need? A household? A city? A farmer? A mining company? A hydroelectric dam? An industrial facility? A drought-stricken region? Or an entire country downstream? This is where water policy becomes political. Suppose one region depends on water for drinking. Another depends on the same water source for agriculture. Another wants it for electricity generation. Another wants it for industry. All of them can argue that they need the water. So equitable water management is not simply about giving people water. It is about deciding how water is prioritized. And this is one reason water could become increasingly important to Africa's economic and geopolitical future. What did COP29 have to do with water? At COP29 in Baku, water became a significant part of the climate conversation. The COP29 presidency's declaration on water for climate action called for integrated approaches to addressing climate change impacts on water basins and water-related ecosystems. It also called for greater regional and international cooperation and for water-related adaptation and mitigation measures to be integrated into national climate policies. COP29 also featured a dedicated food, agriculture, and water day, highlighting the connection between food production, water, and climate change. Nearly 50 countries endorsed the Water for Climate Action Declaration. Why does this matter for Africa? Because climate change is not simply about temperatures. It is also about where water falls, when it falls, how long it stays, and whether people can safely use it. Climate change can intensify droughts and floods, disrupt rainfall patterns and place pressure on water systems. The UN's COP29 materials warned that billions of people already face water shortages and that climate change and population growth could intensify these pressures. So what could this mean for Africa? There are potentially enormous benefits. First, stronger investment in water infrastructure. That could mean wells, reservoirs, pipelines, water treatment facilities, irrigation systems, wastewater treatment, and desalination. Second, better water management. SDG 6 calls for integrated water resources management and transboundary cooperation. That matters enormously in Africa because many rivers and water systems cross national borders. Third, better protection of ecosystems. Wetlands, forests, rivers, lakes, and aquifers are not just environmental assets. They are part of Africa's water infrastructure. Fourth, improved public health. Safe drinking water means fewer people are exposed to waterborne diseases. And fifth, better agricultural productivity. Reliable water can mean more predictable food production. But there is another side. The potential negative effects. The biggest danger is that water management becomes disconnected from affordability and local realities. Suppose a government invests heavily in sophisticated water infrastructure. Who pays for it? If the cost is passed to consumers, water could become more expensive. And remember, SDG 6 doesn't simply say water should be available. It specifically says safe and affordable drinking water. Another concern is privatization. Private companies can bring capital, technology, and management expertise. But if water is treated primarily as a commercial commodity, poor households could potentially struggle to afford it unless strong public interest protections exist. There is also the issue of agriculture. African farmers need water. But if governments prioritize drinking water, cities, industries, or environmental flows, some farmers could face restrictions. And the reverse is also possible. If too much water is allocated to agriculture or industry, communities downstream could suffer. This is why equity does not mean everyone receives the same amount. It means the allocation should be fair, transparent, sustainable, and based on legitimate needs. Which African country could be most affected? If we are talking specifically about water vulnerability, one of the strongest candidates is Niger. Niger faces severe climate and water security pressures, and countries in the Sahel are particularly vulnerable to drought, rainfall variability, food insecurity, and climate shocks. But there is an important distinction. The country most affected by water policy is not necessarily the country with the least water. Sometimes the greatest problem is the combination of water scarcity plus poverty plus population growth plus weak infrastructure plus climate vulnerability. That combination can turn a water problem into a humanitarian and economic crisis. Research examining critically water-insecure countries found particularly severe water access challenges in several African states, including Chad, South Sudan, Somalia, Niger, and Ethiopia. Chad had extremely low access to safely managed water in the study's 2020 dataset. So if international water policies accelerate investment in vulnerable Sahelian countries, the potential benefits could be enormous. But if financing is inadequate, or if policies are imposed without understanding local conditions, the same countries could struggle to meet ambitious targets. What country could be least affected? Here we have to be careful. Least affected does not mean unaffected. A country with relatively stronger water infrastructure and higher access to safely managed drinking water may have more capacity to adapt. Morocco is a strong candidate from an access perspective. Available 2024 SDG 6 data show Morocco with about 80% of its population using safely managed drinking water services, among the highest reported levels in Africa. Egypt was around 79%, Algeria around 69%, and South Africa around 68% in the same dataset. But Morocco has significant water stress. So even a country with comparatively good infrastructure is not immune to water scarcity. This is an important lesson. Water access and water abundance are not the same thing. A country can have relatively high access to safe drinking water while still facing serious water stress. South Africa illustrates this perfectly. Its SDG 6 data show approximately 68% of renewable water resources were being withdrawn after environmental flow requirements were considered in 2023, while integrated water resources management implementation stood at 60%. So the real question isn't, which country has the most water? It is, which country can sustainably provide safe water to its population as climate, population, and economic pressures change? Why this matters for Africa's future? Sub-Saharan Africa already has a major water access challenge. The World Bank reports that in 2024 approximately 840 million people, 68% of the population, had access to at least basic water services, but rural access was only about 53%. That means hundreds of millions of people remain vulnerable. And women and girls often carry a disproportionate burden because they are frequently responsible for collecting household water. So water policy is also economic policy, health policy, education policy, food security policy, gender policy, and increasingly, national security policy. Because when water becomes scarce, competition over water can intensify. And when rivers cross borders, water management can become an international diplomatic issue. The big question for COP31. COP31 will take place in Antalya, Turkey, from November 9th to November 20th, 2026. The question for Africa should not simply be, how much money will be promised? African countries should also be asking, who controls the money? Who controls the infrastructure? Who sets the water priorities? Who protects local communities? Who pays for the water? And most importantly, who gets to decide what equitable access actually means? Because water is not simply another commodity. It is necessary for life. And Africa's future will depend not only on how much water the continent has, but on how effectively, fairly, and sustainably that water is managed. The goal of safe and affordable drinking water for all can be enormously positive for Africa. It could bring investment, infrastructure, better health, stronger agriculture, and greater resilience against climate change. But achieving it requires something more than international declarations. It requires transparent governments, accountable institutions, sustainable financing, local participation, protection of communities, and cooperation between countries sharing the same rivers and water systems. And perhaps the most important point of all, equity should not mean that some people are permanently entitled to more water than others. It should mean that those who are most vulnerable are not left without the basic water necessary to live a dignified life. The challenge is making sure that, while helping those who need more support, the system remains fair to everyone else. That is the water debate Africa should be watching very closely as the world moves toward COP31 and the 2030 deadline. What do you think? Should water be treated primarily as a human right, a public service, an economic resource, or all three? And if water becomes increasingly scarce, who should get priority? Households, farmers, industry, energy producers, or the environment? Let us know your opinion in the comments. And if you want more stories explaining how global policies, climate negotiations, and international developments could affect Africa, subscribe to All Things Africa. Because understanding Africa's future starts with understanding the forces shaping it today.
Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe to remain part of the ongoing journey as we uncover what comes next.